Hey, what's up, y'all? And welcome back to the Invisible Dad Podcast. This is the podcast for all the dads out there that have ever felt unseen, unheard, and unappreciated. But at the end of the day, you still keep showing up. Today, we're diving into something that can definitely feel frustrating, isolating, and even unfair at times. And that's navigating life as the non-primary parent. And you know what I mean. It's the one whose time is limited, whose voice feels secondary, and whose requests are often met with, "We have prior commitments," or "That's not how it's done here." If that's you, I want you to know something right away. You are not failing. You are not invisible because of a schedule or a label. You're invisible only in the eyes of the world, but not in the heart of your child. Every effort, every hour you invest, every moment of patience, love, and presence, it matters. I know what it feels like to constantly battle for time and recognition, or even just a voice in decisions. It's exhausting. It can make you question your worth. You may feel like you're always having to prove yourself, or always fighting for fairness, always trying to convince someone else that your role matters. And yeah, that's draining. That's real. But here's the key. Your value as a dad isn't determined by who holds the primary parent title. Your influence, your bond, and your legacy are built by what you do and how you show up and the consistency that you bring, not by permission or validation. So in this episode, we're going to tackle how to navigate the primary versus secondary dynamic without losing your mind, as well as the subtle ways this dynamic can affect your relationship with your child and how to counteract it. And I also want to talk about the practical strategies to establish the authority, presence, and trust, even with limited time, and the mindset shift that frees you from that comparison, resentment, and frustration. So by the end of today's episode, I want you to feel empowered to own your role as a dad, no matter what anyone else says or does, and to understand that the influence you have is far greater than a label or a title. Let's get into it. All right, before we talk about healing, growth, or presence, we have to talk about the dynamic. Because if you don't understand the system you're operating inside of, everything starts to feel personal, confusing, and heavy in a way that slowly wears you down. When you become a father, you don't imagine that one day you'll need permission to parent. You don't picture yourself having to justify normal decisions or explain your intentions like you're on trial. You assume fatherhood comes with a basic level of trust and authority, that being a dad means you get to be a dad. But when separation enters the picture, the rules quietly change. And they don't change overnight. They change slowly and subtly in ways that are hard to name at first. There's no announcement, no conversation where someone says, "Hey, by the way, your role is about to shrink." It just happens in pieces. A new language starts to show up, words like primary parent and day-to-day decision maker. And at first they sound administrative, like something meant for schedules and logistics. You tell yourself it's just paperwork, just legal phrasing. But over time, those words begin to do more than describe time. They begin to describe power. See, I have joint legal custody of my 2-year-old son. And legally, that means I'm an equal parent. Same rights, same responsibility, same authority when it comes to decisions that affect his life. I'm not a visitor. I'm not a helper. I'm not a babysitter just filling in gaps. I'm his father. But what joint legal custody says on paper and what it feels like in real life can be two very different things. In practice, the parent with more physical time often becomes the default authority. Decisions get made quickly, routines get set, expectations form. And if you're not careful, your role slowly shifts from equal parent to secondary voice. And that's not because you agreed to it, because it happened quietly. Messages go unanswered, conversations don't happen, and yet decisions still get made. That's the dynamic. And it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning. It shows up one day when you realize you're explaining yourself for things you shouldn't have to explain. For me, that realization didn't hit all at once. It unfolded over time, starting with something that seemed small at first. I remember one day I went to the barbershop to get my haircut, and I had my son with me. He was just sitting there in his stroller, just watching the clippers, looking around, taking it all in. Nothing unusual, just a dad running and erranding with his kid. And while we were there, his mom texted me and asked for a picture of him. So I sent one, just a simple picture of him sitting in a stroller in the barbershop. And she replied back and said, please don't cut his hair. I love his curls. And honestly, I was completely fine with that. I had no intention of cutting his hair anyway. I respected it. There was no argument, no tension, just communication. At the time, that moment felt like co-parenting working the way it was supposed to. And then we fast forward about a year. I'm on FaceTime with my son one day, and I notice his hair is in twists. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I didn't like it, but that wasn't even the part that stuck with me. What really hit me was realizing I hadn't been included at all. Like, no heads up, no conversation, no chance to give any input. It was already decided. So I tried to communicate. I sent texts asking if we could talk about his hair. I asked if we could pick a style together, especially since I had respected her wishes before about keeping his curls. I wasn't demanding. I wasn't aggressive. I was trying to co-parent in good faith. I was completely ignored. No response, no acknowledgement, nothing. So when my son was with me, I took the twists out. Not to be petty, just because I didn't agree with them, and because they weren't permanent. Then I was told to stop because she said putting them back in was causing him pain. And I remember thinking, then why choose a hairstyle that hurts him? When he was with me, he never complained. He was relaxed, comfortable, fine. The next time I had him, I noticed there was buildup in his hair from products that were being used. His scalp didn't look so great. So I washed his hair, and then I made a decision. I took him to my barber, a professional shop, someone I trust, a normal, clean environment. And that moment, it mattered to me more than I realized. There is something very meaningful about a dad taking his son for his first haircut. That's not just hair. That's a milestone. That's fatherhood. And he did great. He wasn't scared. He had fun. And right before I went, I did receive a text asking me not to cut his hair. And I saw it. And this time I ignored it. I'm not pretending I handled everything perfectly. I made an executive decision. In that moment, I chose to be a little bit selfish, and I own that. But that decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came after being ignored, after being excluded, after trying to communicate respectfully and being dismissed. A few weeks before Christmas, I was served papers out of nowhere. I had no idea what it was about. No context, no explanation, just paperwork saying I had to show up in court. So I went and realized it was over a haircut. Look, I was at a complete loss for words. Wasn't angry, not defensive, just stunned. I remember thinking, like, did she really just take me to court because I took my son to the barbershop? Like, is she really on that much of a power trip? And when she had to sit there and explain this out loud to the judge, look, let's just say judge was not very happy. The case was dismissed almost immediately, and the judge made it very clear that this wasn't reasonable. Like, it wasn't appropriate, and this is not how co-parenting works. And that moment mattered. And it's not because I won, but because it confirmed something I needed to hear. And that's real authority doesn't need to be announced. It's recognized when decisions make sense. Understanding the dynamic doesn't mean fighting every battle. It means recognizing when something isn't about your child, it's about control, fear, or insecurity. And once you see that clearly, you stop internalizing it. You stop apologizing for being a parent. You stop shrinking yourself. You stop carrying guilt that isn't yours. You begin standing on your role quietly, confidently, and without needing validation. And that's where real fatherhood strength begins. Not loud, it's not aggressive, just grounded. All right, once you start understanding the dynamic, the next trap you'll run into, and it's a big one, is comparison. Comparison will sneak up on you without asking permission. It shows up late at night when you're doing the math in your head. You're counting hours, counting overnights, counting how much time you actually get to be dad in a 2-week stretch. You start measuring your fatherhood by a calendar instead of by connection. And if you're not careful, comparison turns into quiet self-doubt. You start asking questions like, am I doing enough? Do I even matter as much? Is my role just supplemental? That mindset can eat you alive because comparison doesn't just steal joy. It rewrites the story you tell yourself about who you are as a father. And here's the hard truth. If you compare your parenting to the parent who has more physical time, you're always going to feel behind. Always. There will always be more school mornings, more routines, more default decisions, and no amount of effort on your part will ever make that math even. So the real question becomes, what are you measuring? Because time alone is a terrible measurement of impact. I don't see my son every day. I don't get unlimited access to his routine. I don't get to be the default presence in every moment of his life. And for a long time, I let that fact define how I felt about my role. I let the imbalance convince me that I was somehow less important. But that belief doesn't come from truth. It comes from proximity. And proximity is not the same thing as presence. Presence is what happens when you're locked in, when you're paying attention, when you're emotionally available, when you're intentional with what little time you have instead of distracted by what you don't. Comparison tells you they're doing more. Presence asks, what am I doing with what's mine? And that shift matters because once you stop comparing schedules, you start building identity. You stop trying to match someone else's parenting style. You stop reacting to what happens in the other household. You stop playing defense against decisions you didn't make. And you start saying, this is who I am as dad. These are my values. This is how I show up. And that's when things change. For me, comparison showed up most in the decisions I felt I needed to justify. Like, I needed approval to parent, like I needed agreement to be valid. And that mindset made me hesitant, not because I lacked confidence, but because I was trying to avoid conflict. But here's what I had to learn the hard way. When you live in comparison, you parent scared to make decisions, scared to rock the boat, scared to be seen as difficult, and scared dads don't parent freely. They parent cautiously, and kids feel that. They may not understand it cognitively, but they feel it emotionally. They sense when you're holding back, when you're second guessing yourself, when your energy is split between being present with them and worrying about how your parenting will be perceived later. So detaching from comparison doesn't mean you stop caring about co-parenting. It means you stop letting someone else's position define your confidence. It means realizing that your child doesn't experience you as secondary. They experience you as dad. And not the dad who has fewer hours, not the dad who doesn't make the rules, not the dad who needs permission, just dad. And the sooner you internalize that, the stronger your presence becomes. And here's something no one tells dads enough. Children don't compare parents the way adults do. They don't measure fairness by schedules. They don't rank importance by titles. They don't keep score the way we do. They measure safety. They measure consistency. They measure how they feel when they're with you. So when I walk into a room and my son lights up, and it's not because I won some comparison game. Like, that's because when I'm with him, I'm with him. I'm on the floor. I'm in the moment, laughing and engaged. That didn't happen by accident. That happened when I stopped worrying about what I didn't control and started investing fully in what I did. Detaching from comparison also means letting go of the fantasy that fairness will someday feel perfect. It won't. There will always be moments that sting, days you wish you had, decisions you weren't part of. But resentment doesn't give you more time. It just poisons the time that you have. So instead of asking, why don't I get what they get? Ask, what kind of dad do I want my son to remember? Because memory is built on emotion, not logistics. And when you stop comparing, you stop competing. You stop trying to win. You stop trying to be validated. And you start showing up grounded, steady, and confident. Not because everything is equal, but because you know who you are. That's the moment comparison loses its grip. All right, let's talk about conflict. Because if you're a dad in a co parenting situation, conflict isn't an if, it's a when. And nobody really prepares you for how exhausting it is. Not the loud arguments, it's the quiet ones. The emails that sit in your inbox all day, the texts you read 3 times before responding, the moments where you know exactly what you want to say, but you also know saying it won't actually change anything. That's the kind of conflict that wears you down. When you're not the so-called primary parent, conflict has a way of feeling one-sided. Like you're always on defense. Like every decision you make is going to be questioned. Like every boundary you try to set is going to be a problem. And if you're not careful, that pressure pushes you into one of two bad places. Either you explode or you disappear. And neither one of those helps your kid. I want to be honest about my own struggle here because I didn't get this right away. I know I'm a great dad. I show up, I'm present, I'm intentional, I'm thoughtful. That part has never really been in question for me. But when my son's mom and I were in disagreement, my instinct was always to defend myself, not disrespectfully, not angrily, but firmly. Because when you know what's being said about you isn't true, everything in you wants to correct the record. You want to explain, you want to clarify, you want to be understood. So I would explain myself and then explain myself again and then try explaining it a different way. I truly believe that if I could just communicate clearly enough, calmly enough, logically enough, eventually it would click. Eventually there would be understanding. Eventually I'd be seen as the equal parent that I am. And that belief kept me stuck because here's something I had to accept. And maybe some other dads listening need to hear this too. I was never going to change her mind. Never. In her head, my opinion didn't really matter. My explanations didn't change anything. My calm didn't soften anything. And my logic didn't open any doors. And once I really sat with that truth, I realized how much energy I had been wasting. I was stressing myself out trying to control something I had no control over. I was fighting to be understood by someone who had already decided how they saw me. And the wildest part, I was fighting to get time with my own son. So think about that for a second. I wasn't fighting to be right. I wasn't fighting to win an argument. I was fighting to spend more time with my child. And the answer was always no. No matter how respectfully I asked, no matter how calmly I communicated, no matter how logical I tried to be, nothing worked. And that was a hard pill to swallow because at some point you have to ask yourself, why am I exhausting myself trying to convince someone who has no intention of hearing me? And that's where navigating conflict without losing your cool really starts. Not with changing how you talk to the other parent, but with changing how you talk to yourself. I had to take accountability for something uncomfortable. My defensiveness wasn't helping me. It wasn't making co-parenting easier. It wasn't getting me more time. And it definitely wasn't giving my son the calm, grounded version of me that he deserves. That doesn't mean my instincts were wrong. Wanting to defend yourself when something isn't true, that's just human. Wanting to advocate for your time with your child is normal, but learning when to stop defending and start detaching, see, that's growth. Navigating conflict without losing your cool doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop arguing with reality. It means realizing that your job isn't to convince the other parent of your worth. It's to protect your role as a father and your relationship with your child. Those are not the same thing. Winning an argument might feel good for 10 minutes, but staying steady protects your long game. And that's where emotional discipline comes in. And no, that doesn't mean being passive. It means being intentional. One of the biggest shifts I had to make was learning to pause. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to keep reacting the same way and expecting a different outcome. Every time a message triggered frustration, I started asking myself one simple question before responding. And that's, will this response change anything or just cost me peace? And most of the time, the answer was clear. Like once emotions are in the driver's seat, logic doesn't stand a chance. Tone gets twisted, intent gets questioned, and suddenly you're arguing about things that don't even matter anymore. So instead of reacting, I started responding, shorter messages, just clear statements, no over explaining, no defending my character, not cold, just controlled. And here's the part that surprised me. Calm responses do feel powerful, not because they change the other person, but because they change you. They don't escalate. They don't invite chaos. They don't give emotional leverage. They draw a line without drawing blood. Another lesson I had to learn was that, documentation isn't about building a case. It's about staying grounded. When emotions run high, memory gets slippery. Writing things down keeps you anchored in facts instead of feelings. Neutral, boring. And boring is good because boring conflict doesn't spiral. Boundaries were another growth area for me. I used to think boundaries required explanation. That if I didn't explain myself fully, I was being unfair or something. But boundaries don't need justification to be valid. A boundary can sound like, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm available for. This is what I'm not engaging in. No debate required. And here's something nobody tells you about, but it matters. Your child notices your calm even when they don't hear the conflict. Kids are emotional barometers. They feel when you're tense. They feel when you're carrying frustration into the room. They feel when your mind is somewhere else. When I learned to leave conflict at the door, my time with my son got lighter, more relaxed, and more present. And that didn't happen by accident. That was discipline. So here's the takeaway for this segment. Conflict is unavoidable. Defensiveness is understandable, but peace is a choice you can learn. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to change their mind. You just have to stay grounded. Because at the end of the day, your child won't remember the arguments. They'll remember how safe they felt when they were with you. And the dad who learns to stay steady under pressure, that dad becomes unshakable. All right. Let's talk about authority, because this is where a lot of dads feel unsure, especially when they're not labeled the primary parent. When you don't have your child every day, it's easy to feel like your authority is conditional, like it only applies inside a narrow window, like you're supposed to ask permission to be a dad instead of just being one. And I'll be honest, I struggled with that idea for a while. And not because I didn't believe in myself as a father, but because the environment around me sometimes made it feel like my role needed approval. Like my authority was something that could be revoked if I made the wrong decision. That messes with your head if you let it. You start second guessing just normal parenting moments. You hesitate before setting boundaries. You wonder, am I allowed to do this? Or worse, is this going to turn into a problem later? And that hesitation is where authority starts to weaken, not because you're incapable, but because confidence gets chipped away. But here's what I've learned. And what I want dads listening to really hear is this. I didn't have to learn authority the hard way. I didn't have to become harsh, rigid, or controlling to earn my child's respect. What I had to do was trust myself as a father and show up consistently enough for my kids to trust me too. With my 2-year-old, that trust is already there. We've built it together. When I tell him to do something, he listens, and it's not because he's afraid, but because he understands the structure. He knows what to expect when he's with me. He has a routine. When it's time to take a bath, we take a bath. When it's time to brush his teeth, we brush his teeth. When it's time to get ready for bed, we get ready for bed. Does he always want to go to bed when I say it's time? Of course not. He's two. Sometimes he cries, sometimes he pouts a little bit, sometimes he just wants that one more toy, sometimes he wants to play a little bit back, and he pushes back a little, and that's normal. But what matters is how I respond. I don't yell, I don't threaten, I don't overpower him. I get down on one knee, get down to his eye level. I have him look me in the eyes, and I'm gentle, but I'm firm. I repeat what I need him to do calmly and clearly. And then I ask for his confirmation with a simple, okay. And when he says, okay, that's the agreement. And give a high five, a hug, and I give him a kiss on the head, and we keep it moving. It works every time. And it's not because I'm strict, it's because I'm consistent. And that's authority. Authority isn't about dominance, it's about predictability. It's about your child knowing that when you say something, you mean it, and that you're not going to abandon them emotionally in the process. And here's the important part. I didn't need permission from anyone else to build that. I just needed to trust my instincts and show up the same way every time. Now, my oldest son is 12, and that relationship looks very different. And it has to. He's older. He's developing his own opinions. His world is bigger. The challenges aren't about, bedtime and toys anymore. They're about school, responsibility, and effort, caring about his future. So with him, authority looks like, me staying on top of his grades and asking questions about school, holding him accountable when things slip up, letting him know that even when we don't see each other that often, I'm still paying attention. He knows I'm dad. He knows I love him. And he knows my presence doesn't disappear just because circumstances aren't ideal. That matters more than people realize, because authority evolves, but it doesn't vanish. And that's something a lot of dads need reassurance on. Your authority doesn't depend on how many days you have your child. It doesn't depend on a label. It doesn't depend on someone else agreeing with you. It depends on trust. And trust is built through follow through. If you say you're going to do something, do it. If you set a boundary, hold it. If you promise time, protect it. You don't need a long list of rules. You just need to mean the ones that you've set. Kids don't test boundaries to challenge you. They test them to understand you. They want to know where the edges are. They want to know if you're solid. And when you respond the same way every time, they stop testing as much. They relax into the structure, and that's authority. Another thing that helped me was realizing I didn't need to mirror the other household. My home doesn't need to run exactly the same way. My routines don't need to match perfectly. What matters is clarity. When my kids are with me, things work a certain way. Not better, not worse, just consistent. Kids adapt faster than we give them credit for. And here's something important. Your child feels your confidence before they understand your words. If you hesitate constantly, they sense it. If you're calm and assured, they settle into it. And that's why emotional regulation matters so much here. Authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from steadiness. And yeah, sometimes authority gets challenged. It's not by your child, but by circumstances, by outside voices, rules you didn't create. And here's where restraint becomes power. You don't prove authority through conflict. You prove it by staying consistent despite it. You don't overreact. You don't crumble. You don't disappear. You just keep showing up the same way. And over time, your child internalizes something powerful. And that's that dad is solid. Dad is safe. Dad is dependable. That's authority no label can take away. So here's a takeaway I want you to hold on to. You don't establish authority by taking control. You establish it by being trustworthy. All right, let's talk about trust, because if you're a dad with limited time, this is probably the thing that keeps you up at night the most. It's not anger. It's not schedules. It's really not even a conflict. It's that quiet fear that creeps in when you're by yourself. It's the thought that says, am I doing enough? Does my child feel safe with me? Will they trust me when it really counts? When you don't have everyday access, trust can feel fragile, like something you're always behind on, like the other parent has a head start you'll never catch up to. But here's the truth I had to unlearn, and this trust isn't built in hours, it's built in reliability. Kids don't measure trust by how often they see you. They measure it by whether you show up the same way every time. And that's actually good news because reliability is something you can control. When my son is with me, I'm not trying to cram in a lifetime of bonding. I'm not trying to be fun dad every single second. I'm trying to be steady dad because steadiness builds trust, and trust starts with attention, not distracted attention, not half present attention, just full, locked in, phone down attention. When your child is with you, like really with you, they need to feel like they're the most important thing in the world, even if it's just for a short window. And that means, getting on the floor if you have to, listening to the stories that don't go anywhere, watching the same thing 5 times in a row, just letting them lead. You don't need big moments. You need focused ones. Another huge piece of trust is just follow through. If you say you're going to call. If you say you'll be there, be there. If plans change, explain it calmly and just honestly. Kids don't need perfection. They need predictability. Every kept promise is a deposit into that trust bank, and those deposits add up faster than you think. I've learned to be very careful about what I promise. It's not because I don't want to give my son hope, but because I want my word to mean something. And when dad says something, it happens, and that's trust. And here's another thing. Emotional availability matters more than most dads realize. You don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to have the perfect words all the time. You just have to respond. When your child is upset, acknowledge it. When they're excited, match that energy. And when they're quiet, sit with them. And that tells them, hey, my feelings are safe with dad. And safety is the foundation of trust. So let's talk about the small stuff, because this is where trust really gets built, especially when time is limited. When there's something that always happens when you're together, kids clock it. It becomes familiar. It becomes safe. It becomes yours. It's a quiet signal that says, this is us. This is our lane. With my 2-year-old, that might look like, the same way I say when it's bedtime, the same routine before brushing his teeth. The way we clean up his toys each night before bed. It's the hug, the high five, the kiss on the head. He may not be able to explain it, but he expects it. And that expectation makes him feel secure. See, with my 12-year-old, looks a little bit different. It's not about bedtime routines anymore. It's about check-ins, about asking, about how school's going, about reminding him that grades matter because he matters. It might be a quick call, a text, checking on homework, a conversation where he knows I'm paying attention, even from a distance. Different ages, different needs, it's the same consistency. And that's the part dads miss sometimes. Trust evolves, but it doesn't disappear. Whatever you repeat when you're together becomes the thing your child associates with you. A phrase, a routine, a goodbye that never changes, a way you show up when things get quiet. That's how dad time gets defined. And it doesn't have to be impressive. It just has to be consistent. Kids cling to patterns because patterns make the world feel stable. And here's something else that doesn't really get talked about enough. Let your kids, take the lead sometimes. Let them choose the game. Let them pick the order of things. Let them say no occasionally, and respect it. When kids feel heard, they trust faster. And trust also grows when you own your mistakes. If you lose your patience, acknowledge it. If you mess up, say so. Just own it. If you react wrong, repair it. Like, you're not weakening authority by doing this. You're strengthening the trust, because your child learned something important. Relationships don't fall apart when things go wrong, they get repaired. And that's a lesson that lasts a lifetime. And listen, there will be days when it feels like nothing landed. Like you showed up and it didn't even matter. Like the time went too fast or the mood was off or everything just felt rushed. That doesn't mean trust wasn't built. Trust is invisible while it's forming. It shows up later in how they relax around you and how they look for you and how they settle when you're near. You won't always see it right away, but it's there. And here's the mindset that changed everything for me. I don't need to compete for trust. I just need to be consistent. I don't need to outdo anyone. I don't need to make every moment magical. I just need to be reliable, present, and calm over and over and over again. Limited time doesn't limit love, it sharpens it. And when your child grows up, they won't remember the exact number of hours, but they will remember how they felt with you. Safe, seen, and steady. That's trust. All right, now, dads, this is the game changer, and that's mindset. Your role as a dad is irreplaceable, regardless of labels, titles, or schedules. The primary parent, may have more hours, but you have something unique, and that's intentionality. And understand this, because being the secondary parent doesn't diminish your influence. In fact, it can amplify it, because every moment you spend with your child is precious. Every interaction requires focus, patience, and presence. That intentionality builds respect, love, and a sense of security that a passive default presence never could. Shift from asking, do they see me or do I have enough time, to asking, am I being the best version of myself in the time that I do have? And that question refocuses energy on action and not frustration. It's liberating. It's empowering. It's the perspective that transforms fatherhood in limited circumstances. And also stop measuring your fatherhood against someone else's schedule or choices. Your value isn't in approval, it's in impact. Your child will remember the calm, the patience, the consistency, and the love. They won't remember every missed weekend. They'll remember the dad who showed up fully when he could. And lastly, remind yourself daily, I am my child's dad. My time matters, my love matters, my presence matters. And say it out loud if you need to. Let it guide your actions. Let it free you from resentment and frustration. Because your child doesn't need you to be primary. They need you to be intentional, present, and loving. All right, so let's pause for a moment and take this in. Being the secondary parent is hard. It's challenging. It can feel unfair and isolating. You may feel overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued, but here's the truth I want you to carry. Your role is essential, your presence is powerful, and your love is irreplaceable. You don't need the title of primary parent to be a great dad. You don't need the approval of anyone else to validate your influence. You just need to show up intentionally, consistently, and lovingly in every moment that you are granted. Every phone call, every bedtime story, every hug, every laugh. All of it counts. Keep creating memories, routines, and rituals that your child can rely on. Keep protecting your peace. Every day you do, you are teaching your child trust, stability, love, and resilience. This is the Invisible Dad Podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And as always, I see you, I hear you, and I appreciate you. Till next time, keep showing up. Peace.